Most of us grew up with a familiar story about the rise of civilization. In that story, early humans lived in small, simple bands, struggling to survive. Then they discovered agriculture, settled into villages, and inevitably developed cities, governments, and social hierarchies. Over time, or so the story goes, we progress step by step. Primitive nomads giving way to farmers, then to chiefs and kings, and finally to modern nation-states with all their laws and complexities. This tale portrays history as a straight line from savagery to civilization, a ladder of progress with advanced societies at the top and isolated tribes cast as living fossils of our own past. It is a comforting narrative in some ways, suggesting that the world we know was inevitable, that humans naturally moved from ignorance to knowledge, from equality to hierarchy, and that the way we live now is the pinnacle of a long journey. But what if this familiar tale is mostly wrong? What if human history is far more interesting and diverse than a straight line or a ladder of progress? What if at the dawn of everything, we actually had freedoms and social possibilities that later ages have forgotten? These are the questions that arise when we start to peel back the myths of civilization and look at what new research is telling us about our ancestors. It turns out the past was not a single road, and our beginnings were not so simple at all. In recent years, archaeologists and anthropologists have uncovered evidence that fundamentally challenges the old narrative. The latest findings suggest that for tens of thousands of years, humans experimented with many different ways of living. Instead of plodding along one predetermined path, our ancestors tried all sorts of social arrangements. They built large settlements that lasted centuries without kings or bureaucrats. They formed communities that farmed part of the year and foraged the rest, refusing to be pinned down to one mode of life. Some societies created elaborate monuments before they ever planted a single seed in the ground, while others knew about agriculture but chose not to adopt it permanently. There were cities in antiquity that thrived without evidence of palaces or prisons, and egalitarian villages that clustered by the thousands of inhabitants. Large and complex, yet apparently leaderless. There were also times when people in one region consciously rejected the lifestyle of their neighbors, turning their backs on farming or hierarchy as a matter of choice. In short, the deeper we look into prehistory, the more it seems that humanity's early chapters were full of creativity and flexibility. The standard story of linear progress, from foraging to farming to cities to states, starts to look like a myth. History, it appears, was not a monotonic climb, but rather a carousel of possibilities, a grand improvisation with humans as active participants rather than passive subjects of some evolutionary script. This realization opens the door to a profoundly different understanding of who we are and how we got here. To understand how we ended up with the conventional story, it helps to go back a few centuries to a time when Europeans first encountered other ways of life. During the Enlightenment of the 18th century, European philosophers were wrestling with big questions about human nature and society. Thinkers like Thomas Hobbes had speculated that in a state of nature without government, life would be nasty, brutish, and short, a war of every man against every man. In contrast, Jean-Jacques Rousseau imagined early humans as noble and free, living in an egalitarian paradise before the advent of property and kings corrupted everything. These debates were mostly theoretical, but they were also sparked by very real interactions with indigenous peoples of the Americas and other distant lands. As European colonists and travelers met Native American societies, they were astonished to find people who lived in ways entirely unlike European kingdoms. Here were cultures with no kings, no jails, and often a communal approach to life that was both perplexing and intriguing to outsiders. Reports from missionaries and traders described how many indigenous communities valued personal freedom, had robust councils or assemblies, and were quick to mock the pretensions of any would-be authority. One famous example of this cross-cultural encounter comes from the late 1600s, when a French baron named Louis Armand de la Hontan published vivid accounts of his dialogues with a brilliant Wendat, Huron statesman, often identified as Kondiaronk. In La Hontan's writings, this indigenous leader is portrayed calmly but devastatingly critiquing French society. He points out the absurdity of French laws that punish the poor and protect the rich, the way Europeans hoard property while neglecting community bonds, and how they live under the rule of one man, the king, who can do whatever he pleases. According to these accounts, the Wendat philosopher-statesman expresses astonishment that people in France tolerate such inequality and lack of freedom. He finds it baffling that grown men could be told what to do by a king or that they would value money over social good. These dialogues, whether verbatim or embellished by Lahontan, had a considerable impact in Europe. They introduced the indigenous critique of European civilization, a real material example of a society organized on principles radically different from those of France or England. European thinkers, reading or hearing about these ideas, were forced to consider that their way of life was not the only way, that in fact it might be less free or less just than the ways of people deemed savages. The immediate effect of such encounters was to fertilize radical thought in Europe. Philosophers like Montesquieu, Voltaire, and later Rousseau took inspiration, directly or indirectly, from indigenous critiques when formulating their own ideas about freedom, equality, and the ideal society. The very notion of liberty, fraternity, and democratic deliberation that would later underpin revolutions can trace some lineage to the realization that other peoples across the ocean lived in societies without kings or masters, and yet managed to maintain order and dignity. In other words, the encounter with indigenous America played a part in igniting the European Enlightenment. At the same time, however, these ideas triggered a defensive backlash among other European intellectuals and colonial authorities. If indigenous ways of life provided a valid alternative model, that was a threatening notion to those invested in Europe's social order. So, in the generations that followed, a counter-narrative developed to dismiss and diminish indigenous societies. This was the origin of the familiar ladder of progress that we still find in textbooks today. European writers began to frame the difference in evolutionary terms. Yes, they admitted, Native Americans live in apparent freedom and equality, but that is only because they are primitive. According to this view, such peoples were living fossils, representing an early stage of human development out of which Europeans had long ago evolved. By casting indigenous people as childlike or stuck in prehistory, European thought leaders effectively turned the indigenous critique on its head. Instead of seeing indigenous societies as different choices made by intelligent people, they portrayed them as our own past. The freedoms enjoyed by those societies were reinterpreted as naive or crude ways of life destined to be swept aside by progress. This was, quite explicitly, a move to protect the idea that European civilization was superior and inevitable. It introduced a kind of pseudo-scientific, racist hierarchy of cultures, with white, Christian, monarchical Europe at the top and everyone else on the lower rungs, climbing slowly, it was implied, toward the enlightened state that Europe had achieved. That legacy is still with us. It became deeply embedded in Western thought that history is a progression from primitive to civilized, from egalitarian band to despotic kingdom to liberal democracy, or some variation along that line. Even today, popular books often tell the story of humanity in a way that places modern Western society as the highest point of a long evolutionary ladder. You might have seen charts in school showing a sequence. First hunter-gatherers, then herders, then farmers, then a complex urban society, as if each stage naturally follows the previous. This framework also influenced scientific theories about the origins of inequality. It posed questions like, when did we lose our primitive equality and start having social classes and rich and poor? Was it with the invention of agriculture? With the first cities? With the rise of the state? Generations of scholars tried to pinpoint the moment when inequality was born, implying that in the beginning we were equal, and only later deviated from that norm. Underlying all these musings was the assumption that there is a single road of development every society must travel. Some may still be further behind on the road, so-called developing societies, but eventually the story suggests they would all pass the same milestones: farming, cities, industry, and so forth. However, as researchers like anthropologist David Graeber and archaeologist David Wengrow have argued, this whole framework is misleading. It blinds us to what really happened in our deep past. When we drop the idea of an inevitable sequence, we start asking different questions. Instead of, what was the origin of inequality? We might ask, how did we come to be trapped in such unequal systems, when for most of human history we were not? Instead of assuming agriculture or cities automatically create kings and classes, we can ask, why did some societies with agriculture avoid developing rigid hierarchies, while others without farming still ended up with extreme inequalities? These are much more interesting questions, and to answer them, we have to look with fresh eyes at the archaeological and anthropological record, the actual evidence of how early humans lived. So, what does the evidence show when we examine it without the old biases? First, it becomes clear that there was no single primeval state for humanity. Our distant ancestors lived in a variety of ways, not one universal pattern. The latest archaeological discoveries reveal societies that don't fit the old categories at all. For instance, in what is now Ukraine, researchers have uncovered megasites from about 6,000 years ago. Prehistoric settlements so large that tens of thousands of people may have lived in them. These were basically cities in scale. Yet, what's astonishing is that these ancient proto-cities show no sign of kings, palaces, or central authority. There are no grand temples or obvious administrative buildings, no evidence of an army or police force. The settlement consists of many similar houses arranged in rings, suggesting a kind of decentralized urban life. How did they organize themselves? It appears that they might have had forms of collective decision-making, councils or assemblies where people came together to make choices affecting the community. We can't know all the details, but the absence of the usual trappings of rulership tells us these people managed to maintain a city for centuries without a tyrant or a bureaucracy handing down orders. This alone upends the notion that large populations can only live together with a strong hierarchical government. Clearly, they found another way. Another example comes from the Indus Valley civilization, in what is now Pakistan and northwest India, about 4,500 years ago. The Indus cities like Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa were marvels of urban planning. They had grid-patterned streets, sophisticated drainage systems, sturdy brick houses, and bustling trade. Yet, intriguingly, archaeologists have not found evidence in these cities of a royal palace or lavish tombs for warrior kings, or even grand temples that would indicate a powerful priestly class. Instead, the city structures appear surprisingly uniform and somewhat modest. There are granaries and public baths suggesting organized communal activity and perhaps municipal governance. But if there were kings or pharaohs, as in contemporary Egypt or Mesopotamia, they left little trace in the architecture or art. This suggests that the Indus society may have been relatively egalitarian or organized in a different way, perhaps governed by councils or assemblies rather than by despots. It's possible that authority was distributed or rotated, or that merchants and elders ran the cities cooperatively. We aren't completely sure. The Indus people had a writing system we still can't read, but the absence of obvious hierarchy is telling. These cities thrived for centuries and engaged in long-distance trade, all without the familiar signs of top-down rule. Once again, a large, complex society that defies the standard narrative. Beyond these specific cases of early cities, there is the fascinating matter of timing and choice around agriculture. The traditional story casts the advent of farming as a sudden agricultural revolution, a sharp break where humans jumped from wild foraging to planting crops, and then swiftly to villages and property and the rest. But evidence now indicates that in many places this shift was anything but sudden. In some regions, people dabbled in cultivation for centuries, even millennia, without immediately giving up their foraging lifestyle. Take the example of early agriculture in the Fertile Crescent of the Middle East. For a long time, people practiced what might be called low-intensity farming. They would sow a bit of grain along the floodplains when the waters receded, a technique known as flood retreat agriculture, harvest some crops but still rely on wild hunting and gathering during other seasons. They understood planting, they enjoyed some harvests, but they didn't yet pour all their lives into farming or build permanent year-round villages. In fact, archaeologists note that it took something like 3,000 years from the first evidence of cereal cultivation in that area to the point where fully agricultural villages dominated the landscape. 3,000 years is an immense span, roughly equivalent to the time from ancient Sumer until now. If agriculture was such an obvious good or an irreversible trap, why did it take so long to become the main mode of life? It seems ancient people were in no hurry. They experimented slowly, often mixing strategies, perhaps because farming was initially more work or riskier than their traditional ways. They might farm a bit when convenient, then shift back to wild resources if the crops failed or if they just preferred flexibility. Furthermore, the idea that everyone leapt at the chance to farm is contradicted by cases where people consciously rejected agriculture. In parts of North America, for example, communities in regions like coastal California or the Pacific Northwest had the knowledge of cultivation and certainly traded for crops from neighboring groups. Yet they chose to continue primarily as hunter-gatherers. Why? Because their environment provided abundantly through fishing, acorn gathering, hunting, and they may have seen no need to tie themselves down to labor-intensive farming. Some groups witnessed the emergence of agriculture on their peripheries and said, in essence, no thanks, we'll stick with what gives us a good life. In fact, some archaeologists suggest that certain societies were anti-agricultural on purpose. They made a conscious cultural choice to avoid full-time farming because they valued mobility, autonomy, or simply the lighter work burden of foraging life. For example, when early European colonizers arrived in parts of North America, they found indigenous peoples who had rich seasonal diets and well-managed landscapes through controlled burns and wild tending, but who simply did not build fenced farms or permanent crop fields. These were not ignorant people. They were knowledgeable and perfectly capable of farming, but they saw the intensive agricultural life of cornfields and constant toil as undesirable compared to their own rhythms of life. This perspective flips our understanding. Rather than assuming agriculture was an inevitable next step that everyone was waiting to embrace, we see it as one option among many, something that some groups tried and others declined, or did partially on their own terms. Indeed, new evidence from the Amazon rainforest shows that what European colonists thought was untouched wilderness was actually, in many areas, a human-made garden. Indigenous Amazonians had cultivated and managed the forest subtly for thousands of years, enriching it with useful species like fruit trees and palms, and creating dark earth through soil management. They shaped their environment without the kind of rectangular crop fields that Europeans recognized as farming. When Europeans arrived, they failed to see this long legacy of land management because it didn't fit their definition of agriculture. So they labeled the Amazon a pristine wilderness and its inhabitants as primitive forest dwellers, when in reality, those inhabitants had engineered a sustainable abundance very different from European farming, but no less effective. This again reminds us that the binary distinction of hunter-gatherer versus farmer can be a false one. Humans have existed on a spectrum, sometimes blurring the line between wild and cultivated, taking what works best in a given context. Not only did agriculture not immediately lead to hierarchy everywhere, but even where people built cities, it did not always result in social stratification. We already considered Ukrainian megasites and Indus cities. We can add other surprising examples. Ancient Teotihuacan in the Valley of Mexico was one of the largest cities in the world around 1 to 500 CE, contemporaneous with Imperial Rome in population size. Early on, Teotihuacan may have had rulers or a ruling elite, but something unusual happened in its history. The city's later layout suggests a remarkable degree of equality in housing. Many residents lived in what archaeologists call apartment compounds, which were spacious stone complexes that housed extended families or communities. These compounds, numbering in the thousands, are relatively similar in size and design, implying that a broad swath of the population had access to decent living standards. What's more, archaeologists find signs that at some point, the city's major pyramids and elite monuments experienced a wave of intentional destruction or burning. It's as if the people of Teotihuacan rejected the cult of kings or the dominance of a few and reorganized their city along more collective lines. Teotihuacan art notably lacks depictions of singular powerful rulers. in contrast to, say, the Maya cities of the same era which celebrated their kings in stele and carvings. Instead, Teotihuacan art often emphasizes abstract symbols or deities and scenes that don't obviously glorify an emperor. Some researchers believe Teotihuacan might have been governed by councils or a coalition of groups, rather than a single monarch. If true, here we have an example of a city that began hierarchical, but then moved toward a more egalitarian structure, providing decent housing for the many and perhaps limiting extremes of wealth. It's a striking counterexample to the idea that once cities form, authoritarian rule is inevitable. We also see examples of proto-democratic or collective governance in surprising places. In ancient Mesopotamia, often known as the cradle of civilization, the typical narrative emphasizes the kings and empires, powerful figures like Gilgamesh or Hammurabi ruling from their thrones. Yet, historians have noted that in the very early city-states of Sumer, 3rd millennium BCE, alongside the kingship, which often carried a ritual role as much as a political one, there were also citizen assemblies. Some Mesopotamian cities had councils of elders or assemblies of free men that could make decisions or at least voice the community's will. One famous Sumerian epic describes a debate in the city of Uruk's assembly about going to war, indicating that even with a king present, there was a recognized body of common citizens deliberating on important matters. This suggests that the roots of democratic deliberation go far deeper than classical Athens, and they were not exclusively a Western or Greek invention, as sometimes portrayed. Early societies across the world experimented with forms of consensus building and collective decision-making. In the Americas, for example, the city of Tlaxcala in what is now Mexico was documented by the Spanish as a kind of republic. When conquistador Hernán Cortés encountered Tlaxcala in the early 1500s, shortly before the Aztec capital fell, he found a city-state that was governed by a council of chiefs and elders, effectively an indigenous democracy, with no single king. Tlaxcala's political structure was a sharp contrast to the Aztec Empire next door, which did have an emperor. The Tlaxcalans prided themselves on their system, and some historians think this may have been one reason they allied with the Spaniards against the Aztecs. They had no love for the concept of an empire. These instances remind us that people in ancient times were fully capable of inventing councils, senates, and other non-autocratic institutions long before such things became associated with modern republics. All these examples serve to reinforce a crucial point. There was nothing biologically or intellectually pre-programmed that forced humans to organize one certain way. There is no single line of development from primitive to complex. Rather, there's an enormous branching tree of possibilities. In some branches, people chose equality, in others, hierarchy. In yet others, they swung between the two over seasons or years. In some times and places, they accepted leaders but limited their powers or time in charge. In others, they refused to tolerate any boss at all. Human societies have been self-conscious about these choices. They often watched how their neighbors lived and decided to do the opposite if it suited their values. Anthropologists use the term schismogenesis for this process, by which communities differentiate themselves by emphasizing contrast with others. For example, one tribe might pride itself on never having slaves because their neighbors downriver practice slavery. Thus, being the people who never enslave becomes part of their identity. Conversely, a society might adopt extreme hierarchical rituals precisely because they don't want to be like the egalitarian folks over the mountain. This push and pull can drive cultural evolution in directions that have little to do with ecology or subsistence, and a lot to do with values and historical happenstance. Consider the indigenous societies of the Pacific Northwest coast of North America, such as the Kwakwaka'wakw, Tlingit, or Haida. These communities did not practice agriculture. They lived by fishing salmon, gathering, and hunting in rich ecosystems. They had abundant food resources, which allowed dense populations and permanent villages. Over time, many Northwest Coast groups developed a highly stratified culture with nobility, commoners, and even slaves. They held famous potlatch ceremonies where chiefs would display their wealth by giving it away or even destroying it in dramatic fashion, all to assert status and prestige. Here we have people without farms or writing or states, but with social classes and competition for honor. In the same era, not far away, on the plateau or in inland forests, other Native American groups lived more simply in egalitarian bands. The difference wasn't due to a technological gap. It was a social choice, perhaps influenced by the rich ecology of the coast enabling surplus and the cultural feedback of competitive feasting. The coastal peoples consciously developed institutions that reinforced hierarchy, hereditary ranks, ornate art proclaiming lineage, because that suited their historical context. If an anthropologist from Mars visited Earth around 1700 CE, they would see that some non-agricultural societies had nobles and slaves, while some agricultural ones, like certain New Guinea highland communities or many African farming villages, remained relatively egalitarian and acephalous, without a head chief. This Martian anthropologist would conclude that the presence of farming alone doesn't determine social structure. Humans shape their societies in dialogue with environment, neighbors, and their own creative imaginations. One of the most eye-opening realizations from recent research is that many foraging societies, far from being timeless monoliths, actually change their social organization seasonally. Yes, seasonally, like the way one might change clothes with the weather. Certain indigenous groups in North America, for instance, were documented as living in small, family-based bands during one part of the year and then coming together into large collective camps at another time of year, with completely different rules prevailing in each season. The Plains nations who followed bison, buffalo, offer a striking illustration. During most of the year, small bands roamed the grasslands independently, each family group relatively free and egalitarian. But when the season came that the great bison herds gathered and it was time for the communal hunt, these normally autonomous bands converged into one huge camp. At that moment, chaos or disunity could be deadly. Hunting thousands of stampeding bison required strict coordination. So the Plains people would appoint leaders and even a temporary police force to enforce rules during the hunt. Reports speak of warriors known as soldiers or buffalo police, whose word became law for that critical period. They could mete out punishments to any hunter who endangered the group's success, for example, by stampeding the herd too early. They had the authority to whip, confiscate supplies, or in extreme cases, even execute someone who flagrantly disobeyed and ruined the hunt. In essence, for a few weeks, these tribes created a miniature authoritarian regime, a necessary one to orchestrate the complex hunt and subsequent distribution of meat and hides. But here's the catch. When the hunting season was over and people dispersed again, that authority vanished. The same individuals who acted as strict enforcers went back to being normal members of small groups with no special power. The hierarchy was a temporary costume that everyone put on and then took off. It did not carry over into the whole year. It was a solution for a seasonal problem. In this way, the Plains peoples effectively demonstrated that they could self-organize into a disciplined state when needed and dismantle it when it was no longer necessary, returning to a more egalitarian mode of life. Similarly, some Arctic Inuit communities showed almost the opposite seasonal pattern. In the long winter months, families would gather into communal houses, sharing food and shelter to survive the frigid darkness. In those conditions, sharing and equality were vital. No one could afford to let ego or strict hierarchy disrupt the cooperation needed for everyone's survival. Resources like food were passed around liberally, and social life was full of communal games and collective stories. However, in the short summer, when travel was easier and food more scattered, seal here, fish there, berries elsewhere, those large groups would split apart into small hunting units. In those smaller units, a more authoritarian structure might emerge. Typically, the eldest male of a family might act as the leader of his camp, directing the hunt and making decisions. Property, like kayaks, dogs, hunting weapons, became more individuated in summer. Things were marked as mine or yours under the patriarch's oversight. A man might have considerable authority over his wife and children during those mobile months, with clear rules about tools and tasks. Yet when winter came, those distinctions melted away in the big communal igloo. Items were shared, leadership became diffuse or rotated through consensus, And even marital rules could relax. Some Inuit groups historically engaged in partner sharing or other forms of social intimacy during the long winter as a way of sustaining group harmony. So the very same people alternated between a patriarchal, property-conscious lifestyle in summer and an egalitarian, communal lifestyle in winter. They knew of both systems. They embodied both at different times. No external force changed them. It was their own choice, suited to circumstances. It's hard to imagine a more vivid demonstration that human social behavior is flexible and contextual. The Inuit were not locked into being egalitarian or hierarchical. They were both, depending on what made sense at the time. When we learn about these seasonal social experiments, it almost sounds like something out of a thought experiment. What if people could try out being an authoritarian monarchy for a month and then live in a commune the next? Yet for some of our ancestors, this was reality. This begs a question. If early humans could do this, why do we assume that societies must rigidly be one thing or the other? The archaeological record suggests that early farming communities in some regions also might have had seasonal duality. Archaeologists have noted patterns that could be interpreted as seasonal occupation. For example, a site might show evidence of a large population during part of the year and almost none in another, implying that people gathered and dispersed cyclically. There are cases in Amazonia and parts of sub-Saharan Africa where groups practiced farming, but only part-time, and spent the rest of the year in smaller foraging bands. Even in Europe, some early Neolithic farmers may have reverted to more mobile lifestyles periodically, despite having built houses or planted crops. All this indicates that our ancestors were not making an irreversible commitment when they tried farming or when they tried living in a big group. They might do it for a while, then switch back if they felt like it. Such fluidity is the opposite of the standard narrative where one technological step locks you into a new social structure forever. It suggests an image of humans as players of social games, moving between roles and arrangements with creativity. If there is one nearly universal pattern in prehistory, it is the pattern of diversity and change. Graeber and Wengrow phrase it succinctly: the only consistent thing about human social arrangements is that they kept changing. People rarely stayed with one system for thousands of years without alteration. They combined elements in unique ways, tried something, then modified it or abandoned it. There were probably countless political experiments in villages and tribes that left no written record. Perhaps one year a charismatic individual convinced everyone to follow his grand plan, only to be overthrown the next by people who disliked his arrogance. Another village might have tried having all elders rule jointly, then after a quarrel split into two camps, each innovating new customs. Human groups fissioned and fused, formed alliances and confederacies, dissolved and reformed. We can infer this from the patchwork nature of language and culture we see even in relatively recent history. North America, before European conquest, was a tapestry of tiny nations, tribes, confederacies, each with distinct customs, sometimes found only a valley away from a very different culture. This kind of mosaic can only arise from thousands of years of people recombining and reinventing how to live together. There is no reason to think that for the prior tens of millennia, things were any more uniform. If anything, when the world was entirely indigenous, without a few massive powers dominating, the variety of lifeways was likely astonishing. Given this panorama of human social creativity, the big question becomes, how did we get stuck? How did we end up, in the last few centuries, with one dominant pattern, the nation-state, market-oriented, bureaucratically governed world that has crowded out the others? If for ages we could change our social arrangements as easily as changing our hunting grounds, why do so many now feel like there is no alternative to the current way of things? The authors of The Dawn of Everything raise this question pointedly. It's one thing to know that ancient people had freedoms we no longer have. It's another to explain how we lost those freedoms. They admit that giving a definitive answer is difficult, but they offer some thought-provoking insights. One aspect they highlight is the gradual loss of certain basic freedoms over time. These freedoms were so fundamental that for most of human history they were taken for granted, and only when they were curtailed did people truly become stuck. Specifically, we can talk about three vital freedoms that characterized many early societies: the freedom to move away, the freedom to disobey unjust orders, and the freedom to reimagine or reshape society itself. Let's consider each in turn. Freedom to move. In most of prehistory, if you didn't like how things were going in your group, if a leader was becoming overbearing, or a conflict arose, or you just felt restless, you had the option to pack up and go elsewhere. The world was sparsely populated. Land was not owned in the way it is today. One could find refuge in a neighboring band or start a new camp over the mountain or in the next valley. Many indigenous legal systems tacitly recognized this right. People weren't typically tied to a plot of land. Mobility was a social safety valve. If a community tried to impose some draconian rule or exploit a subset of its members, those members could physically leave and either join another group or form their own. Leaders knew this, which put a check on how tyrannical they could act. Push people too far, and they vote with their feet. This dynamic is even recorded in some early civilizations. For example, in ancient Mesopotamia, there are records of indebted farmers fleeing their city-state to take refuge in the land of the Amorites, the surrounding nomadic tribes, when life under the king's taxes and debts became unbearable. The ability to escape made authority precarious. Now fast forward to later periods of history. As states expanded, borders hardened, and most land became claimed by some kingdom or another, that freedom to move diminished. Peasants in medieval Europe couldn't simply wander off west because eventually they'd hit the sea or another lord's territory. Many were serfs, legally bound to the land. In modern times, nations have passports and visas to control movement. The world is partitioned. We cannot just leave a society and wander into a wilderness to start anew. Virtually all habitable land is under some form of sovereignty. For the first time on a planetary scale, humans live in a grid of states that cover every inch of land. This is a profound break from the past. It means, practically, you cannot escape power. You have to face it and submit or fight it, but you can't easily run from it. That loss of the freedom to relocate traps people in whatever system they are born into, a stark departure from how things used to be. Freedom to disobey. In many traditional societies, even when leaders existed, their ability to compel obedience was limited. If a hunter-gatherer band had a headman or a council of elders, typically those leaders led by persuasion or example, not by force. If an individual disagreed with a decision, they might just ignore it without dire consequences, or they might quietly not comply. Social ties and kinship often mediated authority. Someone refused might sulk or gentle pressure might be applied, but rarely could anyone be summarily punished like in a modern army or a state with police. To be sure, this varied. If a community was in a life-and-death situation, like the buffalo hunt scenario mentioned earlier, disobedience could be dealt with harshly for the duration of that task. But such moments were temporary exceptions. For the most part, early leaders had to keep their people happy or risk losing their status, or their people, as we saw, might leave. There was also often a tradition of egalitarian ethos. Anthropologists describe how some hunter-gatherer societies would ridicule or ostracize anyone who tried to boss others around too much or who bragged about themselves. This was a cultural mechanism to keep ego and domination in check. The result is that commands were more like suggestions in daily life. An individual's autonomy was respected. Contrast this with what happens as formal states emerge. Laws are written, backed by force, and disobedience meets systematic punishment. Once you have armed authorities, soldiers, police, operating under a central power, the game changes. If the king says pay this tax or do this work and you refuse, armed men may show up at your door. In modern societies, too, the freedom to disobey authority is curtailed by the pervasive reach of institutions. From childhood, in schools, to the workplace, and in dealings with government, one learns that disobedience has penalties: detention, firing, fines, imprisonment. Certainly one can still protest or resist, but it's no longer a simple personal choice without heavy consequences. It's a risky act that the system will try to correct or crush. Thus, where a prehistoric person could often just say, "No, I won't do that," Today, saying no to those in power is a far more fraught proposition. We've internalized obedience as a social norm to a degree that might astonish our ancestors. Freedom to imagine or create new forms of society. Perhaps the most profound freedom, and the hardest to measure from artifacts, was the freedom to collectively decide on different rules for how to live. Early human communities were, in a sense, engaged in social experiments all the time. If a group of friends around a hearth decided to start a cult of a new spirit, who was there to stop them? They could introduce a new ritual, or redistribute roles, or try out a novel way of allocating food, just by mutual agreement or inspiration. Of course, tradition mattered and elders often guarded customs, but as we've seen, some communities literally alternated customs periodically. There was room to reinvent social reality because nothing was utterly locked in by massive institutions. If one village wanted to organize a grand festival to redistribute everything and start fresh, they could. If a coalition of youth in a tribe grew tired of elders making all decisions, they might wander off together and form their own band with more youth, say. In essence, early societies were continually undergoing fission, fusion, and metamorphosis. Mythology and legend often recall times of great change or migration that reflect these possibilities. Now consider modern society. While change certainly happens, how free are we to truly reinvent our social arrangements? We live enmeshed in complex systems, legal codes, economic markets, national bureaucracies that are extremely difficult to alter in any fundamental way. Even when revolutions occur, they often end up reproducing familiar patterns, a new government that looks much like the old, just with different people on top, rather than wholly new forms. It's not for lack of imagination entirely. People dream of utopias and different systems, but implementing them is staggeringly hard when you have billions of people and established infrastructures. The sheer scale and interlocking nature of modern life mean no small group can decide to live differently without either isolating itself or breaking away on a physical frontier, which, as noted, scarcely exists. We also face an ideological narrowing. People have been taught that there are no viable alternatives to things like money, wage labor, or nation-states. Such concepts are treated almost like laws of nature. The sense of possibility that our ancestors had, that society is malleable, that we can assemble and disassemble our norms, is largely lost to us, buried under the weight of history and bureaucracy. So, the loss of these three freedoms, to move, to refuse, to create anew, can be seen as the mechanism by which we got stuck. Over time, through a combination of perhaps accidents and power grabs, institutions arose that fenced us in, rooted us in place, compelled our obedience, and normalized a very narrow range of social possibilities. But how exactly did that process unfold? History suggests a few key transitions that gradually closed off the escape routes. One critical factor was the rise of fixed property and inheritance, especially of land. When land becomes something that individuals own and pass to their children, suddenly society acquires a new kind of rigidity. In early tribal settings, land often was not owned by individuals. It might be regarded as a common resource or allocated temporarily to those who use it. But as agriculture intensified, certain plots gained value, and families that worked them year after year started to claim them. Perhaps at first it was just in practice. Our family has planted this field for generations, but eventually it turned into formal property rights enforceable by custom or by force. With land ownership comes inequality not just in things but in fundamental security. Some are in, and others are out. Those without land might become dependent on those with it. The owners might accumulate wealth, store grain, acquire livestock, and then hire others or demand labor in return for access to land. A class structure roots itself. Additionally, property gives people a reason to create armed forces or laws to defend that property. Now, a leader or a council has something tangible to protect and manage, which can lead to the establishment of a state-like apparatus, guards, punishments for theft, etc. It can also entrench patriarchy. Historically, once property and especially livestock became important, societies often emphasized controlling women's reproduction to ensure legitimate heirs for property. This could lead to new restrictions on women's freedom compared to earlier times. Many anthropologists note that pre-agricultural societies, while varied, often allowed women significant autonomy and influence. There are even examples of matrilineal or matriarchal tendencies, and certainly women played central economic roles in foraging groups. But with property and patrilineal inheritance, the stakes of controlling lineage rose. Women in some societies became more constrained to ensure paternity of offspring. The rise of strict marriage laws, virginity cults, foot binding, purdah, or other means of limiting women's movement and sexuality frequently correlates with periods where property and class inequality are intensifying. In other words, the freedom of women was one of those primordial liberties that took a huge hit as societies became more settled and hierarchically organized. The authors of these new histories highlight that the loss of women's autonomy is both a symptom and a cause of our broader loss of freedom. When half the population is subordinated in the home and community, hierarchy becomes normalized at the most intimate level of life. Another factor in getting stuck was the melding of various forms of power into one solid structure. Earlier, we considered that there are different sources of domination: control of violence, control of information, and charismatic persuasion. In many ancient contexts, these sources were separate or kept in check by one another. A charismatic leader might influence people, but not have a standing army. A warrior chief might command fighters, but know nothing of grain accountancy or managing a large bureaucracy. A priest might awe people with ritual knowledge, but be physically weak and unable to enforce decisions outside the temple. Because these powers were not unified, no single group could easily dominate every aspect of life. However, over time, especially in the formation of ancient empires, these powers began to fuse. Take pharaonic Egypt as an example. The pharaoh was simultaneously a god-king, charisma and ritual, the commander-in-chief of armies, violence, and, through his scribes, the head of a bureaucracy that recorded everything from temple donations to crop yields, information. When you combine spiritual authority, military might, and administrative control in one institution, you have something resembling the full modern state for the first time. It becomes much harder for an individual to resist or escape because whichever way you turn, power is there. If you don't fear the king's soldiers, perhaps you fear eternal punishment or social ostracism driven by religious edict. Even if you run, the bureaucratic apparatus can label you an outlaw and deny you resources, etc. Not all early states had all three fully. Many only had two and were surprisingly fragile. For instance, the early Mesopotamian states had armies and bureaucracy, but often lacked personal charisma once kingship became routinized. So when things went bad, drought, invasion, people might abandon their cities or overthrow the rulers. Or an empire like the Inca in Andean South America wielded tremendous bureaucracy and religious ideology. But in many conquered areas, they let local elites remain, who had to be won over charismatically. Once the Spanish arrived and broke the spell of Inca divine invincibility, the empire unraveled quickly. It seems that to truly lock in a social order, all the bases of power needed to be covered. Sadly, the colonial era and the industrial era accomplished this in a global way. Modern nation-states ended up inheriting the mantle of both warrior kings and priestly lawmakers, and even added a new element, capitalist finance, which further secures the power structure through economic control. By the end of the 19th century, the world had been divided among states that each had professional armies, centralized bureaucracies with detailed records like censuses, tax rolls, and various ideologies, nationalism, religious authority, etc., to ensure loyalty. People caught in these systems had nowhere else to go and little means to conceive of life beyond them. Yet, history also shows that getting stuck was not an overnight event. There were points of resistance and divergence. For example, consider Cahokia, the great pre-Columbian city near the Mississippi River, close to modern St. Louis, around 1,000 years ago. Cahokia rose rapidly to become the center of a far-reaching culture. It had huge earthen pyramids, elite burials, including perhaps human sacrifices, and signs of class division. It might be considered a fledgling monarchy or chiefdom that achieved a high level of organization and inequality. But interestingly, Cahokia did not last. By the 14th century, it was largely abandoned. The society around it had reorganized into smaller villages, and whatever centralized power existed dissipated. Some researchers think environmental strain or social conflict led people to walk away from Cahokia and its ways. Now, fast forward a few centuries. When European explorers came into the Great Lakes and Mississippi Valley regions in the 17th and 18th centuries, they encountered tribal confederacies like the Iroquois, Haudenosaunee, and others who prided themselves on relatively egalitarian social structures and personal autonomy. It's tantalizing to consider that these later indigenous societies, who spoke of liberty and treated European aristocrats with bemusement, might have been influenced by a collective cultural memory of earlier hierarchical societies, like Cahokia, that they consciously rejected. In fact, some legends among the Ho-Chunk or other nations speak of an earlier time when cruel chiefs had to be overthrown. Whether directly related or not, the point is that humanity did not march uniformly towards more hierarchy. There were zigs and zags. People overthrew or walked away from kingdoms as well as built them. What's different in the modern era is that none of those breakaway experiments survived the onslaught of global colonialism and capitalism. The European conquest and worldwide expansion essentially eliminated all the zones of refuge and brought every people into one interconnected system. The few societies that held out against states, like some remote highland communities or nomadic peoples, were eventually drawn in by the 20th century through national governments or markets, or they survive in marginal spaces, but not as independent worlds fully apart. It's humbling to realize that we live in an age of unparalleled uniformity in certain respects. Not that cultures aren't diverse, they are in language, art, etc., but the dominant political economic system covers the globe. Whether you're in Europe, Asia, Africa, or the Americas, virtually everyone now lives under some form of state authority with laws, pays taxes or tribute, uses money for transactions, and is enmeshed in market relations. Even those who don't want to participate, say an uncontacted tribe in the Amazon, are still impacted because a government claims their territory or a corporation wants their forest. This is a radically different scenario from 1,000 years ago or 10,000 years ago, when many different systems coexisted and one could often find an escape by moving or by banding with others to try something new. Now we have unprecedented knowledge and technology, but ironically many feel a sense of futility or inevitability about the basic structure of society. How often do we hear phrases like, "You can't change human nature," or "Society has to have hierarchy, it's just how things are"? Those phrases echo the old myths that the latest research is calling into question. Human nature, if anything, seems to be incredibly plastic and open-ended. We can be selfish or altruistic, warlike or peaceful, strict or playful, depending on how our society is organized. We lived without formal hierarchies for most of our existence, and also with only temporary ones, and also with extreme ones in some cases. How things are turns out to be a question of how we decide to make them, or how we allow them to be made. With this perspective, the blame for our stuck state doesn't fall on one villain like agriculture or cities per se. Those were just opportunities that could be taken in different directions. Rather, getting stuck was a cumulative result of choices and power plays that ended up removing alternatives. Once a small elite somewhere figured out how to lock in their power, maybe by controlling a food surplus, or by winning a war and enslaving captives, or by getting everyone to believe a certain ideology, then they could impose conditions that made it harder for their descendants or subjects to imagine life differently. Over centuries, these conditions snowballed. Small fortresses became big empires, customs became laws, councils became courts, and the vibrant chaos of many small societies gave way to the massive order of a few large ones. There were surely people even thousands of years ago who lamented this trend. Actually, we know there were. Ancient Greek and Roman literature is full of nostalgia for a lost golden age when humans supposedly lived simply and innocently, perhaps reflecting folk memories of freer times. Chinese philosophers too spoke of an age of virtue in the distant past before emperors. These laments show that awareness of something lost has been around for a long time. However, the new angle from modern anthropology is that those golden age visions were not just wistful myths. They correspond to real attributes of many pre-state societies. Importantly, re-examining early humanity not only challenges our understanding of the past, it also invites hope for the future. If our current social reality is not the culmination of an inexorable natural law, but rather one out of many possibilities that happen to triumph, then it stands to reason that we could create new possibilities once again. The title, The Dawn of Everything, hints at a metaphor. Dawn is a beginning, a time of potential. Perhaps by looking at the dawn of human social life, we learn that everything could have been different, and by extension, everything can still be different. We are not doomed to inequality or stuck forever with the institutions we have. We have, buried in our collective memory, the knowledge of many different ways to arrange society. Our ancestors tried federal systems and council democracies and seasonal anarchies and all manner of hybrids. They had creative solutions to problems of cooperation and freedom that we might draw inspiration from. For instance, consider how they handled decision-making. Consensus processes in indigenous councils allowed everyone to speak until agreement was reached. Frustratingly slow, perhaps, but very inclusive. Or how they handled wealth. Some cultures practiced regular gift-giving ceremonies to prevent anyone from accumulating too much, what one anthropologist dubbed primitive communism in daily life, where sharing was the norm. In some places, if a hunter killed a big animal, he would deliberately downplay it, and others would distribute the meat so that no ego could grow too large. Imagine if corporate CEOs acted that humble today. Even the seasonal hierarchies tell us something profound. It's not that humans always want to be free and equal. Sometimes we want to submit to an authority for a common cause. But crucially, we can do so voluntarily and temporarily without creating a permanent class of rulers. This is a concept almost alien to modern political thought, which assumes you either have anarchy, no rules, or a state, fixed rules and rulers. The ethnographic record suggests more nuanced possibilities. Structured yet impermanent power, authority that comes and goes as needed. Of course, one might ask, even if early humans had all these freedoms and creative social options, can anything like that be revived or imitated in a complex society of billions? It's a fair question. We can't just turn back the clock to tribal times, nor would we want to abandon the many wonderful advancements of civilization, like medicine, science, art, global knowledge. However, understanding our past can expand our imagination. It can shake us out of the fatalistic view that nothing can ever change, or that the systems we live under are the only way to organize a mass society. The argument is not that we should copy specific ancient practices, but that we should be inspired by the breadth of human ingenuity. If city dwellers 5,000 years ago managed to maintain cities without autocrats, maybe we can design modern cities that empower neighborhoods and councils rather than just bureaucrats and billionaires. If hunter-gatherers could consciously avoid domination by simply leaving or shunning would-be tyrants, perhaps our digital age could create virtual or localized spaces where communities voluntarily associate and disassociate to check authoritarian tendencies. If seasonal switching of social structure was possible, maybe we can create periodic resets or rotations in leadership in our organizations to prevent anyone from entrenching too long. Even the notion of play is important. Graeber and Wengrow suggest that humans, throughout most of history, treated social systems playfully. They were willing to pretend and explore, like role-playing different political forms, today a clan council, tomorrow a hierarchy, just to see. Modern politics is deadly serious by comparison, full of rigid constitutions and permanent offices. Maybe injecting a bit more playfulness and experiment, say temporary autonomous zones, pilot communities with alternative rules, civic experiments, could lead to new and better forms of living together. Beyond practical ideas, there is a philosophical takeaway: humility and openness. We often assume we have things figured out, that modern civilization is the apex of progress. But if we pause to consider that Paleolithic tribes or Neolithic villages achieved social arrangements that we struggle with, for example, true economic equality or consensus decision-making, it humbles us. It tells us progress is not one-dimensional. Yes, we've advanced scientifically and technologically, We can explore space and eradicate diseases when we have the will. But in terms of social relationships, justice, and fulfillment, can we really say that a typical person today is unquestionably better off than a person living 10,000 years ago? It's not an easy comparison. The ancient person lacked our creature comforts and knowledge of the wider world, but they might have enjoyed a degree of leisure, community, and connection to nature that many modern people yearn for. Anthropologist Marshall Solins once dubbed hunter-gatherers the original affluent society because, in terms of time spent working and stress about subsistence, many foraging groups had it pretty good, perhaps working only a few hours a day to secure food and spending the rest in leisure, socializing, or ritual. Early records of indigenous peoples often remarked on how cheerful, healthy, and free they looked, in stark contrast to the toil-weary peasants of Europe who observed them. This is not to romanticize the past uncritically. Life could be harsh when nature misbehaved, injuries could be fatal without modern medicine, and there were intergroup conflicts and other hardships. But the point is, the narrative that civilization saved us from a wretched existence is at best a half-truth. It gave us some things and took away others. Many thinkers have contemplated this paradox. Even in the 18th and 19th centuries, some European writers worried that progress brought alienation, crowded cities but lonely individuals, material wealth but moral poverty. Philosophers like Rousseau talked about civilized man being in chains of his own making. In the 20th century, we saw unprecedented material growth but also world wars, existential anxiety, and a sense of disconnection that psychologists and philosophers like Erich Fromm or Jean-Paul Sartre grappled with. We ended up with what David Graeber once termed bullshit jobs, large numbers of people feeling their work is meaningless in giant bureaucratic systems, a far cry from the tangible, direct way a small community dweller might contribute to their group. The relevance of humanity's early social life is that it reminds us that meaning was often found in communal activities, in ritual, in direct relations with one's environment. Early art like cave paintings, prehistoric music, or oral storytelling traditions hints at rich inner lives and cultural depth among people with none of our modern tools. We find exquisite beadwork and carvings tens of thousands of years old that suggest aesthetic sensibilities and a love of beauty as keen as any today. All this pushes back against the notion that we were miserable wretches until the First Empire whipped us into shape. On the contrary, our ancestors had many capabilities and achieved many beautiful things on their own terms. So what do we do with all this knowledge? For one, it can change our attitude towards contemporary issues. Take inequality. Instead of viewing huge gaps between rich and poor as somehow inevitable or necessary for a complex society, we can assert that for most of history, inequality was kept within bounds by choice. Therefore, perhaps we can choose again to limit inequality through different economic models, stronger social safety nets, or cultural shifts that value sharing over hoarding. Take governance. If our ancestors successfully used assemblies and councils, perhaps our modern democracies can be re-energized by giving more power to local participatory councils or by adopting consensus practices in certain spheres. Many indigenous governance principles, like the idea of considering the impact on the seventh generation ahead or ensuring representation for different clans or groups, could inform new approaches to decision-making that overcome the partisan stalemates we see now. Even our relationship with nature might be healed by recalling that many pre-industrial peoples saw themselves as part of the living world, not its masters. The environmental crises of today could push us to rediscover that sense of balance. For example, integrating forest gardening principles from the Amazon or water management techniques from ancient flood-based farming could provide sustainable alternatives to our extractive practices. It's also inspiring on a personal level to realize that ordinary people, not just great leaders or geniuses, made history by cooperating in novel ways. The impression one gets from the old progress narrative is that big changes were out of the hands of individuals. They just happened when technology changed or population grew, like an automatic process. But the new narrative suggests people often chose their destinies. They debated, experimented, negotiated with one another to form new social compacts. It gives agency back to our ancestors. If a tribe sat around a campfire and said, "Let's try living differently tomorrow," and then did it, why can't we? It might be harder now with millions involved, but change still begins with people deciding to imagine alternatives and convincing others to give it a go. Throughout history, even within large states, there have been social movements that attempted to recapture some of that flexibility. For example, religious revivals sometimes tried to create communities of equals, like certain early Christian sects or other religious communes. Some frontier towns in various eras became places of more fluid class structures or unique local rules. The spirit of experimentation never fully died, it's just often been co-opted or crushed by larger powers. Knowing that experimentation is a deep part of our legacy gives us strength to keep trying. In reflecting philosophically on all this, one might conclude that human nature is not a fixed blueprint, but a palette of potential. We have been rule followers and rule makers, fierce egalitarians and ruthless tyrants, wanderers and settlers, innovators and conservers. Any attempt to pin down human nature with a single label, competitive, cooperative, hierarchical, docile, aggressive, etc., will fail because we've been all those things at different times. Instead of survival of the fittest hierarchy, one could argue our true advantage as a species has been adaptability in social organization. We aren't the strongest or fastest creatures, but we are possibly the most socially dynamic. In small groups, we can self-organize without external compulsion. In crisis, we can unite under a leader. We can form networks of trust that span huge distances, as evidenced by ancient trade routes that moved seashells and amber hundreds of miles among unknown people. We can also fracture and isolate when needed. That dynamism got us through the harsh uncertainties of the Ice Age and allowed humans to spread to every continent. Ironically, now that we've dominated the planet, that dynamism seems hidden under the weight of our giant systems. But it's likely still there, waiting for moments of opportunity to show itself. One might speculate that in times of great stress in the modern world, such as natural disasters or perhaps future global challenges, people often revert to basic cooperation and mutual aid, reminiscent of simpler societies. We see glimpses. When a hurricane strikes, neighbors often band together spontaneously to clear debris and share resources, essentially bypassing any formal hierarchy for a time to get things done collectively. That suggests that the instincts for flexible cooperation and equality are not gone. They're just not the official operating mode most of the time. There is also a moral dimension to reconsidering the dawn of everything. How we imagine our ancestors influences how we judge ourselves and others. If we think of prehistoric people as brutes, we might conclude that strict authority and discipline are needed to curb our base instincts, echoing Hobbes's view. If we think of them as innocents in a paradise, we might conclude that civilization has corrupted us and perhaps idealized primitivism, echoing some interpretations of Rousseau. The truth is more nuanced. They were neither demons nor angels, but people with full cognitive and emotional lives who made decisions, sometimes wise and sometimes foolish. They experienced love, envy, generosity, cruelty, wonder, just as we do. They were not intellectually inferior to us. Given the same information, they were just as capable of philosophy or logical reasoning. In fact, when Europeans sat and talked to indigenous Americans or Pacific Islanders in the 1700s, they often found them to be quick-witted, eloquent, and sharp in debate. This should be unsurprising, as human brain size and capacity haven't significantly changed in tens of thousands of years. What differed were the cultural contexts and accumulated knowledge stores, but not the innate intelligence. Recognizing this continuity helps dissolve any lingering notion that some people, whether in the past or present primitive societies, are behind on some evolutionary scale. We are all part of the same human story, and those who came before were feeling and thinking beings as worthy of respect as anyone today. This realization carries an ethical imperative. It invites us to look at contemporary indigenous or traditional societies not as living relics or curiosities, but as equally valid reservoirs of human experience. It's heartbreaking that so many ways of life have been erased or are under threat from the spread of the dominant system. languages, customs, and entire cosmologies have disappeared. But rather than dismissing those as the necessary price of progress, maybe we should see it as a tragic loss of knowledge and diversity that could have enriched us all. Every culture is in a sense an experiment in how to live. By eliminating so many, we've reduced the library of human possibilities. Thankfully, enough records and studies remain for us to at least partially reconstruct and appreciate some of those lost possibilities. We can read about the San of the Kalahari and how they maintained equality through constant sharing and humility. We can study the council democracies of the 6 nations of the Haudenosaunee, Iroquois, and how they achieved a federation that balanced power between clans and maintained peace through consensus. In fact, it is well documented that the founding fathers of the United States were inspired by the Iroquois Confederacy's model, an indigenous blueprint influencing a modern constitution. We can learn of the philosophy of Ubuntu from Southern African societies, which emphasizes that a person is a person through others, a radically different orientation than Western individualism. We can marvel at the Pacific Islanders who navigated by stars and built societies on tiny atolls through communal labor and strict resource management to survive precarious environments. Each of these is like a treasure chest of ideas. None is directly transferable to the modern world in whole, but each contains principles or values that might help us steer our own society to a better place. In piecing together the true story of humanity's dawn, we don't end up with a tidy textbook timeline. Instead, we end up with something more like a vast, open landscape dotted with the campsites and creations of many different tribes and cities, each with its own story. It's a landscape of memory that belongs to all of us. And in that landscape, we find that we were not forced onto a single path. Rather, we walked many paths and even doubled back on ourselves often. Sometimes we ran into dead ends and turned around. Sometimes we found paradises and inexplicably left them after a time. One might wonder, why did those Ukrainian megasites eventually empty out? Why did the people of Tatalhoyuk, a very ancient large village in Anatolia, live in basically equal houses for over 1,000 years without ever building a temple or palace, and then eventually disperse? We don't fully know. It seems our ancestors valued the ability to change course as much as stability. They did not always pursue growth or conquest. Frequently they favored social harmony or spiritual pursuits or the sheer freedom of not being tied down. This has a contemplative lesson for us. We often assume bigger is better, or that once a technology or system is introduced, it will inevitably spread. But many times in the past, humanity chose not to maximize certain things. For instance, there are parts of the world where people knew about the concept of the wheel or metallurgy but didn't adopt them widely, perhaps because their way of life didn't require it or even made it impractical. This doesn't mean they were incapable. It means they weighed the pros and cons and sometimes stuck with what worked for them. In the Amazon, pottery was invented and then seemingly abandoned in some areas. Likewise, large organized states arose in parts of the Americas and then dissolved, and later inhabitants did not rebuild them, preferring a different lifestyle. This is astonishing to the modern mind that always expects growth and continuity. It indicates a different prioritization, quality of life or cultural values trumping mere expansion or accumulation. Do we have the wisdom today to say enough when needed, to not follow every trajectory to its extreme if it might lead to imbalance or suffering? That's something we might relearn. The ability to step back from the brink, to consciously simplify or decentralize if that yields a more humane existence. As we gather all these threads, the freedom to move, to refuse, to reinvent, the conscious experiments of the past, the loss and the hope, we find ourselves confronted with a new narrative of humanity. It's not a narrative of inexorable progress or of fallen perfection, but of continuous self-discovery. Humanity has been, in a sense, searching for how best to live for as long as humans have existed. That search never had a single answer. It produced myriad answers, each provisional. For a while, one mode of living might flourish, say a tribal confederation that keeps peace and happiness, but then circumstances shift, climate change, migration, new contact with outsiders, and that mode is challenged. Some solutions persisted and spread, like certain agricultural techniques or eventually industrial technology, not necessarily because they were better for people in a deep sense, but often because they enabled greater population growth or military power. If one group chose a hierarchical, warlike route and built an army, it might conquer the peaceful, egalitarian neighbors, and then its system becomes dominant, not by virtue of being more just or fulfilling, but by brute force. Many argue that a lot of the world's inequities spread in that way, not by consensus that this is the best way to live, but by the triumph of power. Yet the story is not only the victors. It also consists of countless acts of resistance and preservation. People carried old values through dark times, waiting for a chance to bring them back. In medieval Europe's feudal oppression, peasants still held on to communal practices in the margins, like sharing common grazing lands or mutual aid in villages that echoed older freedoms. In the Americas, even after conquest, indigenous communities would sometimes flee into hills or hidden corners to live on their own terms. The spirit of freedom never entirely died. It went into hiding or blended into syncretic forms. Now in our contemporary world, we stand at a crossroads of tremendous challenges: global warming, economic inequality on a massive scale, cultural homogenization, and rapid technological changes that can empower or enslave. At such a juncture, knowing the breadth of our history is like having a fuller map of our human capabilities. It suggests that solutions might come not just from new inventions, but from remembering who we have been. Perhaps to move forward, we also need to look back and reclaim some of the wisdom of earlier ages. Not in a naive way, but thoughtfully. For example, consider how to incorporate a modern version of the freedom to move. Maybe it could mean creating international agreements to welcome migrants and refugees, acknowledging that the right to seek a better community is a fundamental human thing, or how to allow the freedom to disobey in constructive ways. Maybe by designing workplaces that are more democratic, where employees have more say and can challenge decisions safely, rather than the top-down corporate model. And how to regain freedom to imagine society, possibly through civic assemblies, like citizens' assemblies being tried in some countries, where regular people come together to discuss and propose laws, breaking the monopoly of professional politicians and reminding us that we collectively have the right to shape our world. One could say we need a new enlightenment, one that this time actually listens to the diversity of human experience, including voices long suppressed. The Enlightenment thinkers of the 18th century made great strides in challenging monarchy and envisioning rights. But as we've seen, they partly drew from indigenous critiques and also got some things wrong by dismissing those very indigenous perspectives too quickly when the noble savage trope took over. Today, perhaps we can do better. Anthropologists, archaeologists, and historians are bringing to light knowledge that was previously ignored. They are giving us back parts of our story that were torn out of the book. With those pages restored, the story becomes much richer and more empowering. It tells us that we are a species capable of reinventing itself. It's remarkable that after millennia of experiments, we now have the opportunity to consciously synthesize lessons from all of them. A scholar from the present can sit with data from Ice Age camps, Bronze Age cities, Amazonian forest gardeners, steppe nomads, and industrial urbanites, and try to distill what works and what doesn't for human flourishing. Our ancestors didn't have that bird's-eye view. They only knew their local contexts. We, for all the burdens of modern life, have the benefit of global knowledge and historical hindsight. Will we use it to break free from our current stuck path and choose a better one? That remains to be seen. It requires imagination and courage, and perhaps a shift in values. We might need to care less about constant growth and more about sustainable harmony, an ethos many ancient cultures held. We might need to resurrect the idea that economic systems should serve people, not the other way around. An idea that was obvious in small communities where human relationships took precedence over wealth accumulation. In conclusion, exploring the dawn of everything, our deep past, does not diminish the achievements of the present. Rather, it casts them in a new light. It shows that our ancestors were not waiting for the modern world. They were living full lives with their own genius. It also shows that many problems we think of as modern, inequality, alienation, loss of community, have very old roots in the processes that gradually limited our primeval freedoms. By learning how those roots took hold, we might find ways to loosen them and let new growth occur. The dawn of everything is, in a sense, still with us. Every newborn baby arrives with the same basic human toolkit that a baby born 30,000 years ago had: curiosity, playfulness, the capacity for empathy and for forming bonds, the urge to explore. It is society that then channels those innate qualities into the molds of the day. But if those molds ever become too restrictive, humans have a knack for breaking them. Perhaps we stand near the dusk of one social order and the dawn of another, even if we cannot yet see the light. If so, remembering the grand spectrum of our past will be a beacon to guide us. We may discover that the key to our future lies in the question Graeber and Wengrow boldly pose: not how we came to be unequal, but how we came to believe that we could not be otherwise. By reclaiming our story, one where we were once free to roam, to say no, and to shape our world anew, we reclaim the hope and the power to create a new dawn for everything yet to come.